This is session 3 of Can't We All Just Get Along? Conflict in Congregations. When we left off in session 2, we were talking about the different issues that may cause conflict. As we continue on, one of the things I want to make sure that you know is that there is great potential for sin within the church system. And this is the reality. The potential for sin comes in the response or the reaction to conflict. And that's where we have to be particularly careful as leaders in conflict, dealing with conflict. Part of the reason for that is there is often a legacy of pain within a church. It's not just pain within the church families or the individuals, but it is also pain that may have happened in the history of the church. There may be hurts unresolved. There may be conflictual situations that were never taken care of. There may be sin that was never dealt with in the congregation, sins that were left unaddressed. Often I have been in situations where perhaps the pastor had had a breach of morality, and the church never did actually deal with that. They simply moved on as quickly as possible, not realizing that there is some baggage that comes with that kind of a situation. The church adapts to the emotions of the weakest person in the congregation. This has to do with identified patient, which was a concept we learned in the last session. The identified patient may be a parishioner that is causing a great deal of disruption in the congregation, or perhaps just a parishioner who is the loudest and who makes the most noise. And that parishioner will take the energy of not just the leadership and the pastor, but the whole congregation, if in fact the leadership allows that to happen. And so there is great potential for sin because what you're doing is reacting to that person rather than actually dealing with the situation as it is. The person who is the most dysfunctional will sap the energy of the mission, the vision, the personnel, and the congregation. This is one key concept that you must remember when dealing with conflict in a congregation. I want to say that again. The person who is the most dysfunctional will sap the energy of the mission, the vision, the personnel, and the congregation. For instance, you may have a person who has been very active on Facebook, who is perhaps arguing with people in the congregation on Facebook. Rather than dealing with the mission of the congregation, if the pastor spends most of her or his time, in fact, addressing this person's dysfunctional behavior on Facebook, then what happens is the mission goes by the wayside. You forget why you're a church in the first place. You forget what your whole vision is in sharing Jesus Christ with your community. Churches act like dysfunctional families because we all bring our dysfunctions from our families to the table. So, if a pastor comes from a family that has systematically denied conflict always, then the pastor may well function in that way, may simply deny that there is any conflict that is going on. In doing so, we simply push the can down the road, kick the can down the road, I believe is the phrase, and we never deal with it, which means it stays in the congregation. And the reasoning for sin, for the potential for sin in the congregation, is because of the distortion of thinking that happens because of our families of dysfunction from which we all come. For instance, as an example, a distortion of thinking may be magnification of a person, either thinking the person is all right or all evil, all good, all godly, or all evil. Very few of us are so totally consistent we don't have bad habits. Very few of us are so totally consistent that we are all bad and we have no good habits or no good things that are going on in our lives. And there is a distortion of thinking when you actually magnify a person's tendencies to make it that that's all the person is. None of us are black and white. All of us have a lot of grays and a lot of shadows in between. Another distortion of thinking may be dichotomization, and this is very easy to happen. It's very easy for a pastor to get into this corner and think this way, or for leadership to think this way. It is dichotomization. Dichotomization is us versus them. The leadership or the pastors may think it's us against the congregation, or the congregation may think it's us against the pastor. Or one side may say, for instance, the traditionalists may say it's the traditionalist against those who want to be radical. Perhaps we talked about worship wars earlier, perhaps those who would like the traditional hymnology as opposed to those who would like the choruses. You take sides and you end up seeing everybody on one side or the other side. That's a distortion of thinking because, like I said, most of us have inconsistencies in our way of thinking, which is not a bad thing. And then there is overgeneralization. It is very important in an argument or a disagreement to not say certain words. Always, never, no one, everyone. You always do this. The pastor always says this. That lady on the board of trustees always does this. She never trusts anyone. No one likes me. Everyone thinks I'm a horrible person. Everyone ignores me in the congregation. This overgeneralization, again, is another distortion of thinking. Pastors and leaders can get hooked into the reactivity of the systems. And part of the reason they can do that is because they buy into this distortion of thinking. What is really important is for pastors and for leadership to continue to remember that overgeneralizations, that thinking of something as all good or all bad, or thinking of your disagreement as us versus them is inevitably a sign that you are going to go into reactive behavior rather than responsive behavior. The difference is the emotions. Reactive behavior is when you let your emotions take control or drive the car, rather than let your thinking and your vision drive the car, which is the important way to deal with it. Pastors can become as symptomatic as laypersons, as lay leaders do. Pastors' spouses may become reactive, and then pastors get defensive of their spouses. This can happen anytime. So the distortion of thinking can happen within the leadership, within the pastoral staff, or within the congregation. When this escalates, then conflict becomes unmanageable. When people start reacting and stop responding, then sin becomes the potential in the church. The behavior becomes sinful, the thoughts become sinful, the attitudes become sinful. Well, I'm not going to play. I'm going to take my toys and go home if they don't do it my way. This is a sinful way of dealing with conflict. It is important to remember that history of a person, history of a family, and history of a congregation play a significant role in the way you react or respond. Healthy or unhealthy responses are learned behaviors. For instance, when I was growing up, my parents never argued. They never disagreed in front of us. I never heard them argue, and so I assumed that people who had a good relationship would never argue. Oh boy, was I wrong when I figured that out. But they didn't do conflict in my family. And how families do or don't do conflict is contagious. That's the way we learn to do conflict. On the other hand, I have seen families where the way they do conflict is they call each other names all the time. Destructive, damaging, hurtful, hateful names. And when that happens, then all thinking goes to the bottom of the barrel. You don't think through what you're doing. You just say the thing that is the most hurtful thing to say. What has happened in the past when conflict has arisen in our families influences our responses today, influences the way we sit on a board or a committee, influences the way we respond or react to conflict within the congregation. And so as Paul says in Romans 7, wretched one that I am, who will deliver me? But there is an answer. And as we finish out this conference, I want to spend these last 10 minutes talking about a healthy way, some steps that you can take in trying to be healthy in dealing with the conflict in your congregation. The first one is to manage your own stress in the response. And this is back to the concept of self-differentiation. Every single person can manage his or her conflict in a more healthy manner by developing these three commitments or these three attitudes. The first is the commitment to your perspective. I have prayed about this. I have thought this through. I have done the research that I needed to do, and I feel that this is the right decision. So it's commitment to your perspective. The second, then, is commitment to the relationship you have with the person. I may disagree with John Brown, and I may say, I disagree with you, John Brown. But because I disagree with John Brown does not mean John Brown is no longer my friend. I can no longer worship or go out to dinner or enjoy family relationships with John Brown's family and with my family. My commitment is to my relationship as well as my perspective. And then the third commitment is the commitment to the tension between your perspective and the relationship. So, although I am very close friends with John Brown, and although I am convinced that my perspective, as I've thought it through, is different from John Brown's, what I am most importantly committed to is the relationship, the tension that comes between our relationship, my relationship with John Brown and myself, and our perspectives, which are differing. The thing to remember is relationship, relationship, relationship. Because we disagree does not particularly mean that we lose fellowship with one another. We simply state, this is my opinion, this is where I stand on this matter. I recognize that you stand in a different place on this matter. You are still my brother in Christ. And let us continue to sit at the table and talk about this. So that's step one, manage your own stress in the response. By managing your own stress, it means that you recognize there will be tension. And in spite of the fact that there will be tension, you are committed to continuing to try to work on the relationship and work on how you're going to deal with the issue that has come up. And then step two is addressing the conflict, dealing with the reality of the conflict. Denial is unhealthy. It's unproductive. It will result in further complication. Not only does it kick the can down the road, it also adds more baggage, more garbage to the can as you've kicked it down the road. Make sure that you are responding and not reacting to the conflict. So I say in the first place, denial is unhealthy, so you can't deny it. But at the same time, when you address the conflict, make sure you are responding to the conflict, not reacting. First, give yourself some time to gather your thoughts and calm down. I mean, anybody who's a parent understands that you can't just lash out when you're really angry, as all of us have been as parents, but you have to stop and think through what the whole issue is. What's going on here? So give yourself time to calm down. And then listen. Make sure you understand the person's perspective. It could be that you simply misunderstood what the person said. It could be that you misunderstood what the person meant when they said what they said. Because as someone once said, we all speak a different language. My idea of arguing may be different than your idea of arguing. We have children who say to us, You're yelling at me. Well, it may be that I've never raised my voice, but even though I haven't raised my voice, the tone of my voice may have indicated that I was in fact yelling or trying to discipline my adult children. So make sure that you understand the person's perspective. Their perspective may be you're being judgmental when you don't mean to be judgmental. You don't know that you are communicating that bit of being judgmental. And then also in making sure you're responding and not reacting, never name call. There's no reason to shame, to degrade, to insult, or to indulge in biblical abuse of a person. When you are disagreeing, simply state your disagreement. And the last thing in making sure responding and not reacting is realize it's possible you can be wrong. There are things that all of us can learn, no matter how long we've been Christ followers, no matter how long we have been in leadership, no matter whether we're the pastor or the parishioner. Realize that it's possible that you can be wrong. In dealing with the reality of the conflict, I also want to say, do not put off addressing the issue. I talked about denial. When you have a handle on the situation and yourself, then be intentional about addressing the matter. Do not deny that there's a matter, and do not react without thinking. But there is a middle ground here. Think through, calm down, and then when you feel like you have a handle on the situation, then address it intentionally. This is a way of dealing with the reality of the conflict. And finally, step 3, do not burn bridges. It is important that you say nothing that will destroy your example as a Christ follower. It is also important that you say nothing that will destroy your relationship with that person. Do not burn bridges. Part of the reality of conflict management is negotiation and compromise. Many people think that in conflict management, somebody wins and somebody loses. But the reality is that when we actually deal with conflict, most of the time we negotiate and we compromise. We win, both of us win some things, and both of us lose some things. Neither party will get everything he or she wants when you deal with conflict. We have often recently talked about the fact that the Congress cannot work together. And as I've observed it, one of the things that I've observed is that very few people are willing to actually negotiate. They want it all their way, and the other side wants it all their way. But if we negotiated and compromised, we would recognize the important priorities of both parties. And so we can work together to see where we can get a win-win. Recognize that conflict is exactly that. It's a disagreement on an issue. It may also be a deeper disagreement on priorities. Do not destroy a relationship because of a disagreement on an issue or because of a disagreement on priorities. If you destroy the relationship, you lose all possibility of being a support to that person, as God has called us to do. At the beginning and at the conclusion of a conflict issue that you are dealing with, reiterate a commitment to the relationship you have with each other. Therefore, the situations in dealing constructively and in a healthy manner with conflict are 3 steps. Manage your own stress in the conflict, deal with the reality of the conflict, address it, and then do not burn bridges as you are addressing the conflict. This is a very simple conference on dealing with conflict in congregations, according to Murray Bowen's theory of family systems. I pray that your congregation will be able to deal with conflict in a more healthy manner. Thank you very much.